This is actually one of my first experiences with immersive VR. I've done 3D models before of architectural environments, and I've done things with basic little walkthroughs, but they've never been immersive. The first time I walked into this tomb tour, I was very dizzy. I was overwhelmed by it. I'm the kind of person who gets motion sick on the train commute into work every day, so it was a bit overwhelming for me. It really feels like you're in here. You hear the noises of the lamps. I think it's 36 degrees Celsius when I'm in here. It feels hot to me just because I think I'm in Egypt. It's extraordinary. The other thing about this VR model is it's so much finer detailed than I would have expected. The paintings in Nefertari's tomb particularly are known for their high quality. They're beautiful, they're detailed. But because they've aged and been damaged over the 3,000 years since it was first made, even if I went to the tomb, I get the feeling I wouldn't have been able to see the details that clearly. Lots of it has been damaged, and even with heavy restoration and conservation works, the fine detail's not always there. Not to mention they keep the lights very low to protect the paintings from further damage. In this environment, there's no risk of hurting anything, so the lights are quite high, you can see everything, you can get right up to them. There's no fear that you'll accidentally bump something and knock plaster off the wall. Your breath won't hurt anything. So the quality of what we're seeing in here is extraordinary, and I can get right up to it see it as close as possible. It's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen. I'd love to see more of this just because even in tombs I've been in, I bet I'd get more out of it from the virtual experience added on. I'd realize new details all the time. That can be debated. No tomb in ancient Egypt is exactly alike. Nefertari's is of a somewhat similar layout to tombs of her era, including her son's tomb, which is essentially right next door in the Valley of the Queens. We get the idea that the top room, which we're in right now, is sort of a staging area of like, welcome to the afterlife. Here's the characters you're going to meet inside. Here's Nefertari actually being welcomed in by one of the goddesses, holding her hand and taking her in to meet the other characters. As we go further down the tomb, it's actually played out like it's a journey into the afterlife itself. You're descending deeper and deeper into the afterlife, and you're facing more obstacles. You face all the gatekeepers that you have to pass through in order to get to the final destination of, the good part of the afterlife. They called it the Field of Reeds, and you'd have a mansion there, and you'd get to retire and live on your estate and go to parties every night and hang out with the gods. So there's this idea of increasing complicated religious detail as you go further and further into the tomb. You've got really complex spells written on the walls. You've got passwords and the names of all the gods, really deep philosophical stuff down there. Up here, it's always kind of a nice evocative intro to the tomb because you have characters people might know. You see her hanging out with the gods. You see her interacting. This is the Nefertari we'd like to see in real life. She looks like she's alive, she's dressed as a queen, hanging out with all the gods. When you go deeper in the tomb, you see the sort of narrative pictures fall away. You can't really tell what's going on just by looking casually. It's gateway after gateway after gateway of obstacle you have to go through to the afterlife. And the Egyptians really saw the afterlife as a complicated journey that was not to be taken lightly. So of course she has all this complex information in her tomb. Up here is sort of the idea of what the end goal is. Why should she want this afterlife? Well, look at all the wonderful people she'll get to hang out with. Look at all the wonderful food she'll eat when she's inside. It's not quite divided between the living world and then the dead world up here. It's all part of the afterlife, but it is seen as a journey and a progression of once you make it, you can have all this. Ancient Egyptian culture was very different than what we have today. It was not tied with so many of the rules that we consider to sort of inherent, mostly because of monotheism, because of Judaism or Christianity or Islam. Those religious practices tend to come with a lot of rules of what you must do and what you must not do. The Egyptians had some universal truths like that too, but in terms of religion, they didn't necessarily believe things were wholly good or wholly bad. They believed that everything had a place that could be balanced within the universe. And so even their bad gods, even the ones you'd think were dangerous demons of destruction, even the ones who kill Osiris and murder each other, they still have a place within the universe because everything is necessary to be in a balanced order. There's no one universal truth. There's no one God and all the rest are wrong. So they could always bring in ideas from other places. If you met a Greek and you were an Egyptian, you'd say, hey, you have a sky god, you have a sun god named Apollo, we have a sun god named Ra. Maybe they're the same person. Maybe our religions are kind of the same and we can worship them in the same place and not have a fight about it. They'd never say, no, you're wrong, heresy, off with your head. And so in that case, it was a society that could embrace a lot of differences. Now, they did have moral codes like don't steal, don't murder. They had very strict law codes. You could be punished, you could go to jail, you could be fined, you could be executed. It's not to say it was a completely, liberal society in which everyone could do what they wanted. They believed in the rule of law and the rule of order. But there wasn't a lot of top-down involvement in regulating people's lives beyond making sure they weren't disrespecting the gods, making sure they were paying their taxes, that sort of thing. Ancient Egyptians really believed they had the best of everything in the world. And foreigners, they kind of felt bad for. They're like, oh, the poor Greeks over there, they don't have the Nile flood to bring them all this water and good things. They have to wait for it to rain. Isn't that sad? They can't count on the gods to bring them all these blessings all the time. One of the things the Egyptians feared more than anything else was dying outside of Egypt. If you had to go on a business trip or travel for trade, which they did a lot, the fear is you'd be outside of the perfect world and maybe your gods won't find you. You'll be in this world of foreigners. So the Egyptians definitely had a superiority complex, but they could embrace other people into their religion as long as you were willing to adapt to their rules, which again, as I say, were pretty good for the ancient world. As long as you're willing to fit in according to their social customs, you were pretty much embraced by it. You could get along with everyone. It's really hard to decide when a culture begins and ends, because basically nothing begins and ends. It always changes along the way, and maybe you won't recognize it at the end from where it started. There's some people who argue very strongly today that ancient Egyptians who live in Egypt now still carry many of the same social practices as ancient Egyptians. Now they have mostly, for the most part, 90% at least, have a different religion. They're usually Islamic and a handful of Christians. But so they're definitely not worshiping these gods anymore. But lots of their calendar still runs on ancient Egyptian words. There's still some really interesting ideas about land tenure and legal rights that are still tied back to ancient Egypt. So I think it's unfair to say that ancient Egypt ever ended. It did change a lot. As for when it begins, we know that the Nile Valley was settled very, very early. There's some evidence of early agricultural activity, and they do from the early on start to do things that we would recognize even in a casual case as, oh, that looks Egyptian. They start to use hieroglyphs around, we'll call it 3000 BC, and then their writing appears. By then, they've got lots of their gods known. If you looked at the early Egyptian art, you'd probably be able to guess it's Egyptian, just because some of these traditions are so classical, they've remained throughout the thousands of years. If you've seen a human drawn in Egyptian art, you will always see them with their shoulders facing ahead towards you, but their face in profile, and their legs kind of in profile too. These are standard rules of Egyptian art that were invented thousands of years, around the pyramids time. But 1,000 years after the pyramids were invented and created, and all the big ones at Giza, they weren't making pyramids like that anymore. They changed to smaller pyramids. They changed to tombs that were underground. And here we stand in about 1255 BC in the Valley of the Queens. Right across the hills will be the Valley of the Kings, and those are royal tombs. You'd think they'd have a big pyramid over them, but they're completely hidden underground. They're not meant to be flashy signs of this is where the king is buried. It's the exact opposite now. This is meant to be a secret place where the king's buried to keep him safe. But it's still the same culture. They're still worshiping the same gods. They've still got a lot of the same art, a lot of the same spells. So there's always been change in Egyptian culture. If you want to know from a very practical point of view, if you want to be an Egyptologist, what you're going to have to study, you mainly have to study 4000 BC to about 30 BC, and that's when the Romans take over after Cleopatra's death, and maybe you extend it a little bit further to like 300 AD or 300 CE, if you want to call it that. But it's unfair to put these artificial timelines on the beginning and end of ancient Egypt because it's always been here, it's always been changing, and it's always been talking to other people. So pinning it down as this is what ancient Egypt is, well, that's what it was at that moment, but over here in this town at that moment, it was a completely different thing. It's like defining what's an American. We think we have a start date, but do we really? We were here before that. There were people acting here, and it was all part of the building of this experience. Being an American now isn't what it was like 50 years ago either, but we're all still American. So it's a complicated question. I think any study of the past, you really have to think not in terms of what's concrete, but in how change happens slowly over time, and maybe it drifts in one direction or in another. But what makes it the same even as it changes? Everyone pretty much admits you can go like, oh, that's Egyptian. If you go to an Egyptian museum collection, you can, even a little kid can go, that's an Egyptian thing. Why is it so inherently Egyptian if they change so much over time? There's so many factors of the art that are traditional but inventive. The tomb is accurate in scale and dimension and size. The people who made this tomb model worked on all the architectural and archaeological references that have been published since the tomb was found in the early 1900s. They also were able to go to the tomb itself as it is today and take photographs. However, this isn't a reflection of the tomb as it is today. It's a recreation of how it would have looked when it was brand new, when the paint was just fresh on the walls. So this model shows very minimal areas of damage that you'd see in the real tomb today. It's essentially fresh, perfect new paint. And that took some work by the VR team to restore missing parts of the paint. So for instance, if a piece of the plaster had fallen off here, they'd fill it in, match the colors, match the textures of the surface. And in most cases, it's seamless. I mean, unless I have my notebooks and my comparison photos side by side, there's many areas where I don't recognize that it's filled in, that they've done some repair work. So in the case of accuracy, it's a very close reflection. I believe it's a very faithful reproduction of what it would have looked like in most cases. But it is a virtual model that does have a little bit of artistic license in the idea of what would have been there. If the plaster's missing from a scene and we can't tell what the scene was, if there's not enough clues remaining, then maybe it's better to leave that wall blank in some cases, or in other cases within this tomb, they've gone and filled in a scene that might have been there based on other tombs of the time period. It wasn't in Nefertari's, but it's an accurate reflection of Egyptian religion. It's a really tricky project because this is a very specific tomb. This is the tomb of Nefertari. It's not just a general Egyptian tomb where you could sort of have creative license to fill in, oh, we'd expect a weighing of the heart scene on this wall, and we'd expect this. With Nefertari, if there's areas that are blank, we don't know what to expect because there's nothing like Nefertari's tomb anywhere else in the world. She was an individual of great power and great importance, and you have to be careful in filling the blanks in her tomb. I do think this model is really, really good at sort of giving an almost seamless view of what it would have felt like to be inside. It's very evocative. There's the natural light provided by the oil lamps. You can even hear them crackling when you're inside. It feels not too shiny and perfect, but it's lived in. It's a usable space. Unlike a model that would reflect the actual tomb as it is today, this does a really good job of immersing you in the idea that you're in an ancient space. You're in a tomb as it would have looked. And in that case, it's great for exciting people about ancient Egypt. You have to be careful in pointing out, like, well, we filled in this part, we made that guess because we have this evidence and this evidence. But as far as a sort of casual tour through and go, this is what ancient Egypt's like, this is the artwork, welcome to the space, it's a really great, useful model for pointing out lots of details. The Egyptian idea of beauty we hear about in terms of, well, we've got Nefertari, whose name literally means something like the beautiful one or the beautiful companion. She's often cited as one of the most beautiful women in history. And in this tomb, they've taken a lot of great care to show her really perfectly in detail. She's tall and thin, her proportions are always the same. Beautiful profile. In some paintings, they even take the time to fill in her cheeks as if she's blushing. So we get the idea of what an idealized body type would look like for ancient Egypt. But this is a tomb, and in a tomb where everything you represent is going to reflect your afterlife, you only show the most ideal. You never want to show yourself looking older or unfit or out of shape or ill or anything like that, because by showing yourself as this lovely tall lady, you're going to be this lovely tall lady for the rest of eternity. There's, as with any culture, there's a discrepancy between what they think is perfection and what they actually expected in people, what they thought actual humans looked like. With Nefertari, we don't know what she looked like other than what these tomb pictures represent. And there's actually a wide variety of depictions of her within this tomb. Here she's shown as quite pale. In some scenes, she's almost painted as if her skin is pink. In others, she's quite dark red or even brown. None of these necessarily reflect the truth about her skin color, but, the artist's representation at the time. The question of what color ancient Egyptians were, as in what ethnicity or race, if you like, is very tricky, because ancient concepts of race are not at all like ours. They knew there was a variety of skin tone and color, but it wasn't necessarily a black-white issue. The Egyptians thought themselves the perfect people, hands down. They were the perfection, and everyone else was a lesser version of them. And they do have pictures in tombs of other people. There's the Egyptians, which look like this, and then there's the non-Egyptians, which are not ideal, but they're still recognizable types. And so in that case, they have the Nubians to the south in what is now Sudan. And when they're depicted in Egyptian art, they do look darker. They look like sub-Saharan African groups that we'd expect to know today. When the Egyptians talk about the Asiatics, which is over, in Palestine or in Turkey or whatever, they depict people who are fairer skin and usually use a yellow or pale paint. Same with the Libyans. But the Egyptians were very interested, not so much in skin color, but as categorizing the way they were different than Egyptians. So they always draw people with fantastic costumes and crazy hats and beards, everything that marked them as not Egyptian. Egyptian is the normal starting point for an Egyptian artwork. In truth, the Egyptians were probably quite a mixed ethnicity culture. If you look where Egypt's positioned, it's right at the, merging point of three continents. It's on Africa, it's right next to Asia, and it was part of the Mediterranean world, so it was always talking to Europe. I don't think by any means they were Northern European pale people like we would consider white Northern European or Anglo-Saxons or anything like that. They probably weren't full sub-Saharan Africans either. The only requirement Egyptians had for considering yourself Egyptian was that you be in Egypt, you speak Egyptian, and you worship the Egyptian gods. And then they had the phrase, you must drink from the Nile, which basically means you must be in Egypt, you must be a part of Egypt. Egyptian is more a cultural group than it is an ethnic group. We even have examples from tombs throughout Egyptian history where we know, for instance, a Nubian from the south, who would identify probably today as black, married an Egyptian lady and raised a mixed family. And in their artwork in their tombs, they will sometimes show a man who looks quite black compared to an Egyptian woman, and kids in between of all different colors. So sometimes they'd really note, hey, look at our mixed heritage. We are proud to be here. We are still Egyptian because we're bearing ourselves in the Egyptian way. But look at the clothes we wear. We've got a belt on that's very typical of Nubia. So the question of cultural identity in the ancient world isn't very tied down. There were no strict rules. You couldn't ever go down the street in the ancient world and go, you're not enough for Egypt. You could basically prove you are an authentic Egyptian if you worship the Egyptian gods. If you acted Egyptian, you were allowed in.
If you walked like an Egyptian.
Exactly. If you walked like an Egyptian, if you talk like an Egyptian, if you eat the foods, if you worship the gods, it's I don't want to say it's a blended culture because they're not always proud of foreign influence. They're at war with the world for a lot of time. It's an empire. They like to conquer other peoples. But they're also pretty understanding of people who are willing to adapt. And by the end time for what we usually consider ancient Egypt, by the time the Romans take over, we think of the Romans coming in and ending everything and making everything very Roman. Well, most of the Egyptians by then had been speaking Greek for 1,000 years and trading with India, and it was a big ancient world. Ancient Egyptians were trading with Afghanistan as early as like 4000 BC. They were getting lapis from Afghanistan. So they were never an isolated culture of we're just Egypt sitting here alone in our Egyptianness. They're always talking and trading and interacting, and that includes marriage and having kids and genetic legacies that can be quite complicated. Of course, they had no idea what genetics were back then. They would basically come down to, yeah, you look Egyptian, you were dressed like an Egyptian, and you're being Egyptian now. Everyone's always fascinated by mummification. That's how I got here. I read a book when I was 6 about mummification in ancient Egypt, and look at me now. It's this slightly disturbing to our modern culture. It's so foreign to us. But to the Egyptians, it made total sense. It was the most practical, religious, and respectful thing you could do for someone. If in the afterlife you need your body, you need all your parts to survive and be preserved forever. And yes, magic will help and it will restore things, but still, better safe than sorry. Protect everything you can, make it last forever. That includes the body. And Egypt's a very dry climate, so they seem to have realized really early on in Egyptian history that if you dry out a body, or if you dry out anything for that matter, it won't rot, it won't get stinky, it won't fall apart. And so most of mummification really just involves drying out a body. They'd cover it and fill it with salt. They had a lot of natural salt deposits in Egypt. They'd sometimes use other things like sawdust or resins from trees that smell nice. They could essentially pickle the body or preserve the body. Anything they could do to make it last longer. And over time, they started to get very scientific about it. They started to realize, well, it's easy enough to dry out the outside of the body, but the inside's full of wet stuff. So we're still going to need that stuff in the afterlife, but if we take it out and dry it separately, magically it will all become restored in the afterlife. So you're going to need your stomach in the afterlife because you're going to want to eat all the great food. You're going to need your lungs because you're going to want to smell the perfumes and the flowers. But if you leave them in the body of a dead person, they will rot and the body won't last that long. So Egyptians started taking out some of the internal organs, mummifying them separately, and then they'd usually put them in a little box near the mummy so that when the afterlife happened, when you were restored in the afterlife, all your parts were close enough they could be reunited. There's some interesting stories from the ancient world of people who had lived a long life and lost a leg to illness or to warfare or something. And sometimes they'd be buried with false legs that they used in life, but the spells on them, the idea that they'd become real too. The idea is you want to be whole in the afterlife. What's interesting from our point of view is the organs they prized the most were the lungs, the stomach, the liver, the intestines, everything, having to do with breathing and eating, and the heart. But they didn't care about the brain at all. The brain, they thought, was just wetness in your head that came out your nose when you had a cold. They didn't think it had anything to do with personality, your thought. They thought all of that came from your heart. And it makes a lot of sense because your heart does give you a reaction when you are surprised. You feel your heart race. We even say when you're happy, my heart skipped a beat. So the idea that the brain is actually the center of, who we are as an individual, I think of myself as my brain. That's a pretty modern thing. The Egyptians thought it was all in your heart. So they really preserved the heart. That was the most important. That's where your soul, your personality is. They're going to protect that the most. The brain, they didn't want all that wetness in your head as a mummy that might spoil your body. They just took it out and threw it away. Really good, blow your nose, clean it all out. And to us, that's barbaric and crazy and destructive, but to the Egyptians, it makes the most absolute sense. We're doing what we need to do to make the body last forever in the most respectful way possible. They're not doing it to be mean. They're not punishing anyone by taking their brain out. This is what you do to honor the people you loved in life, to make sure they get to live forever. The people that have come through the tour, it's funny because everyone has an avatar, and so I can't really tell what kind of demographics I'm dealing with. Lots of times people will introduce themselves like, hi, I'm here from Cairo tonight. It's so exciting to be talking about Egypt with you. Lots of people from very far across the world. I'm standing here in San Francisco talking to people who are in quite rural outback Australia, and we have a conversation about how virtual reality can bring together school groups of children in remote places. We haven't had a dedicated school tour yet, but I'm really excited about the possibility of that. I know we've had some children. I haven't asked their age, but from their voices I can probably guess. And they've asked the best questions. The children who come in on these tours are really, really thoughtful and ask great questions about the afterlife and about, well, why would they do this? And what does it mean that they do this? Instead of just staring at the pictures and being quiet guests, which a lot of people are. That's great. I'm glad they're here. But I really like the immersive experience of talking to these people across the world. It's even better when the guests start talking to each other. We've had whole conversations about, well, what should this tomb tour do next? Where should we go from here? And they just start talking and brainstorming ideas. It's wild in here. The conversations are really extraordinarily fun. VR is amazing in its ability to add to educational tours. Like I said, I would never have been in this tomb. I've never been in this tomb until this opportunity right now. The fact that this is a virtual tomb allows so much more access. Lots of people can't go to Egypt. It's hard to get there. It's a commitment to go on tour in Egypt. And even if you go there, because the tomb is in such a fragile state still, it's a very limited group of people who can get in. It's only 100 people every day. Couple that with the fact that it's not always easy to get around in Egypt. If you have trouble with access, you don't like walking up and down stairs, you're not getting in and out of these tombs very easily. I have trouble with the heat, and I work in Egypt on purpose. I've fainted in Egypt because of the high temperatures before. But virtual reality really takes away a lot of these obstacles of access in terms of money, in terms of location, in terms of physicality. It really allows wide groups of people from all over to be in this tomb, and to be in this tomb at the same time and talk from different parts of the world. The conversations we've had in here have really been extraordinary in sharing ideas. It's always really funny to hear someone say, like, well, it's 11 o'clock at night here, but thank you for your good morning. You know? Another thing I've really learned from virtual reality, having not been in this tomb myself, I studied it from books for years, and I've seen all the photographs, and I've seen the plans, and I thought I knew what the tomb looked like. And then the second I got in, I started seeing the way the room is shaped, the way the actual walls fit together. Instead of just seeing this wall on one page of a book and this wall on another page of a book, they're all connected, and you can see how the scenes flow from one to another. There are scenes in here where Nefertari is giving praise to a god that's on the wall across from her. And you wouldn't know that reading a book. Someone might point it out in the text, but it becomes really obvious that these tombs are about a journey and a conversation and being in the presence of all these afterlife creatures. It makes it real in a way that I would never have got unless I had been in the tomb myself or been in this model. It's extraordinary. I think it's fantastic. Where else have I given tours? It's funny because I've never given a tour within Nefertari's tomb. I've never even been within the actual Nefertari's tomb before. So this virtual reality model is really my first experience inside here, which is pretty funny. I've also given tours at the site I work in Egypt. It's called Karanis. It's in a place called the Fayum. I run the dig there and give guest tours and school tours to whoever comes by the site that day. It's a big ancient city, and we've still got lots of the houses and the temples intact, and you can walk through the remains and see what daily life was like. It's one of my favorite places to work in the world. I also give tours to museum groups. I give walking tours whenever I'm on vacation to whoever will listen. When I drag my family along, it's always like, oh, look over here, let me tell you about this obscure object in the corner. I give a lot of tours, whether they're formal or appreciated or not, I'm afraid. I don't think I do. I'm just really excited about it. To be completely honest, I think it's thrilling, and I hope there will be more, not just in Egypt, but I'd like to see things from across the world that I wouldn't get to, that I know nothing about. I would love to do a tour of a cliff dwelling in southwestern United States. I would love to do Machu Picchu. I would love to do clearly stuff I've studied like Pompeii and ancient Rome and things, but give me something I never would have gotten to do in my life, and I'm there for it. This is just so exciting. It's not the same as being in Egypt to be in this tomb, but it's revealing a lot that I wouldn't have considered. And the fact that I can take the time and study close in detail and really see things, they're great high def and everything. I just think it's a great opportunity, and I can't wait for more people to have access to VR like this, because I think it's really going to change how people learn and see the world.